Welcome to everyone to Beyond the Pitch, Building Productive Relationships Between Journalists and PR Professionals, brought to you jointly by the Religion Communicators Council and the Religion News Association. My name is Ryan Coe. I'm actually the national president of the RCC, and I'm thrilled to be acting as your moderator today. And for this collaboration between our two organizations, I think that we have a lot to learn from each other, a lot to discuss with each other, and so I'm very grateful for today's webinar. I want to just remind everybody that we do have the chat function going. There will be some time for some Q&A from the audience, either throughout the program or at the very end. And so if you have questions, just please put those in the chat so that I can review those and look at those and ask them to our esteemed panelists. Another just housekeeping item is to please keep yourselves on mute during the course of this so that we can pay attention to the speakers and what they have to say. The final note is that this will be recorded and shared on YouTube and over email after the event. Feel free to check that out and feel free to share that with anybody who wasn't able to attend in person and might benefit from the conversation that we have today. I have with me four fantastic speakers, and I'm really grateful for their willingness to participate and to join in the conversation today. The first is Rina Guidos, who is the Latin America Regional Correspondent for the Global Sisters Report. Then I have Jonathan Merritt, who is the Vice President and Executive Editor at Simon & Schuster. Then I have Kevin Ritter-Young, who is the Director of Media and Communication for the Metropolitan New York Synod of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. And finally, Kathleen Rice, who is the Director of Communications and Public Relations for the Ursuline Sisters of Louisville, Kentucky. And Kathy also sits with me on the board of the RCC and is a fantastic friend as well. So I just kind of want to, open with some kind of broad questions to kind of set the scene a little bit. Religion reporters and denominational communicators often operate with different goals in mind, but we work in similar spaces. So to start out the conversation, maybe a twofold question. What does success look like for each of you in your individual roles? And what does success look like in working together with the other half, I guess you could say, if you're a journalist with a spokesperson, if you're a spokesperson with the journalists. And so let's just take this in the order that I introduced you all in, and we'll start with you, Rena, and then we'll go on to Jonathan.
I think, one of the successes that I'm seeing right now is with this whole issue of immigration in the Trump administration. There's something happening in our country right now that has caused a lot of concern with religious communities, various religious communities. And, we want to know what's happening, what your point of view is. We want to know if you're doing, letter writing, if you're going to rallies. I think there's been amazing communication between reporters and religious communicators, especially, just knowing what's going on because there is so much going on. What we want to do is we want to know what's going on, at this moment, why you're doing it. And I think that, communicators and also their organizations, want that point to get across. For me, because I work with women religious and religious communities, what they want to get across is that this is the gospel for me. And it's a message that they want to come across to the population in general of this country and outside of this country, but also to Catholics themselves who don't see the gospel in the same way. And I think that has been a really great success story for both of our fields.
So if I can ask you, before we move on to Jonathan, if I can ask you to pull it back a little bit, not a specific case scenario, but generally speaking, what have been the elements that have contributed to the greatest success between yourself and the other side?
I think number one is the urgency of what's happening, and also the degree to which is happening. And the fact that, I think in some other issues there had been, for me at least, I felt a little bit of a distance with some communications folks and some organizations. I think, there's fewer of us, but I think, since now the field is open anywhere in the world where we work from, there's been kind of a little bit of a disconnect, and immigration sort of brought everybody together because everybody's so paying attention to one field, which is good and not good, but this has become such an urgent issue that I think it's made us work together, in instances where we normally wouldn't have, in the past. Because I think there's fewer on both sides. There's fewer religion communicators and there's fewer journalists.
Thank you. Thank you, Rena. Jonathan? You're muted, Jonathan.
I'm sort of in a unique role. I've spent my career both as a journalist and doing some publicity work as well. And now I'm in this really unique role at Simon and Schuster, where I'm overseeing our religion and spirituality category of books. But I think that the challenge that I face is similar to a lot of folks on this call. One, I'm looking for stories and voices that matter. And so you're having to kind of sort through the stories that need to be told, the voices that need to be heard. And that's sort of the first challenge. The second challenge is, how do you get readers to care? How do you get people to read these stories? And my challenge has gotten even greater having moved from journalism now to book publishing because, as you all know, the stories that matter often have a lot of nuance to them. And that means that they require, the more the nuance, the higher the time commitment for readers to fully grasp the depth of the stories that we're trying to tell. And in the world that we live in, the greater the time commitment, the lower the engagement. People are consuming in very short sound bites. So when you're asking people to read, a 300 or 400 page book versus watching these sort of vertical videos, it's a really difficult ask and it's a big challenge. And so it's one of the things that I'm really focused on is, how do I uncover those stories? How do I make them matter to as many readers as possible?
Right. And do you have an example of when it's been able to come together?
Yep. Well, I can tell you kind of a general principle that may even be more helpful. One of the things that we have realized is it used to be that you would come up with an idea that was interesting. And what we've realized is that interesting is no longer enough. It has to be urgent or useful. So it has to be immediately apparent how someone will use this book, right? So devotionals are really big right now. Anything that has a practical application. So if you can tie the subject matter to the reader's lived experience. And I think that works, by the way, in a small, a shorter form and longer form. So how do you make something useful, or how do you make it immediately urgent to that reader's life? So we're always thinking about that. Sometimes the same story can be told, and it's just in the way that you frame it. Of course, journalists have been doing that for a long time. So have publicists with press releases. How do you frame something so that within just a few moments, people they're so inundated with information that you are having to frame something within a few seconds, or they just simply move on. And so that's the challenge for us. But we found urgency and usefulness have been two really important triggers.
That's interesting you say that because that's what Rena said too, especially the urgency bit of it, right? This is what you need to know now. Um, Kevin, I'd love to hear your insights.
Yeah, so I'm serving as the director of media and communication for the Metro New York Synod of the ELCA, and that's our sort of denominational body. And I'm a bit of a generalist, so I'm doing everything from like acting as a spokesperson to like producing our social media and newsletters and even just doing some sort of internal work on our website. So we're kind of firing on all cylinders here. But I think like one thing that's very important for me in this role and the stories we tell is we serve a wide and diverse constituency. And I think it's really important that we tell a wide range of the stories happening throughout our community. And that can include anything from like people organizing around labor and immigration in Long Island, sort of growing congregations in New York City who are predominantly immigrants and non-English speaking, to sort of like mutual aid ministries happening in the Hudson Valley around diapers and like baby care. And like it's very important for me to communicate this work both to our existing constituency, many of whom may not know what's going on in other parts of our region. But a good partnership with a journalist can like highlight this work and frame it in a like wider context for people that we don't yet know well. And I think that's really the benefit to us for working with skilled journalists, is finding ways to reach audiences that we're not reaching well yet on our own.
So here's a question though, because you're talking about a wide variety of things, a wide and diverse story. Do you find it difficult sometimes to work with journalists who are focused on one beat or one particular avenue?
I mean, that's a real benefit to working with journalists, is they can tell that one beat very well. I would never like expect a journalist to be able to tell everything we're doing in one story. That's not a realistic ask for them or frankly for me. But to work with someone who can distill an aspect of your work is really useful and important, I'd say.
Thanks. And let's wrap it up with Kathy.
Well, success for me, because I work for Catholic Sisters, and I think most people have kind of a preconceived idea of what a Catholic sister is and what she looks like and what she does. And success to me, is when someone says, after reading an article, I did not know that about Catholic Sisters, or I didn't know a sister could do that. And because my sisters, like a lot of Catholic sisters congregations, are, they've embraced Vatican II. So they're very much out in the world. And and also another part of that, as some of the other folks have said, is when it comes to social justice messaging, us responding to the migrant crisis, it is important to get that out to the journalists. So, that's another challenge, is kind of keeping ahead of this constant news cycle about this and figuring out, okay, what does a journalist want to see from me that would, validate it getting publicized. So, that's always my goal, is to tell our story and tell it honestly, but also kind of wade through what I think is going to be interesting versus, that's kind of what everyone is doing, so to speak.
So if I can build on that a little bit, my next question that I had was, can you share a specific example where a respective or creative relationship between media and a religious organization led to a stronger, more nuanced coverage, right? So the other three can think about that, but Kathy, I want to ask you specifically, because you're talking about, trying to uh, break down some of those preconceived ideas, trying to help people understand that sisters aren't what they think of as sisters in their brain, right? Um, do you have specific examples of where you were able to paint a different picture of the sisters, give people a different view, and specifically maybe change the mind of the journalist as to what the sisters are about too? Because I'm sure the journalists often have that same preconceived notion of what sisters are, um, just like the general public.
Hmm. Um, well, there is one example with a journalist where she was reporting on a documentary somebody made about my congregation, and she had several things in there that just were incorrect about what sisters are. She was calling us nuns. We're not nuns, we're sisters. Nuns are cloistered, that kind of thing. So I always look at my job as educating. And you can't assume people always know what you're about. So in that case, I reached out to her, and I think that's key is to not be defensive, but reach out and have a dialogue. And that's what I did. And I said, hey, there's a few things in here that you may not have understood. And she went on and corrected those. So I counted that as a successful encounter. So
I would I would count that as successful as well. And that's really good of her to understand that she maybe did get it a little bit wrong and to apply that nuance like Jonathan was talking about earlier to the reporting. Jonathan, do you have any examples?
Yeah, it's sort of interesting. Any examples in my role? I'm in such a unique position. I think the thing that's unique about my job is I'm constantly having to do work. We work a lot with journalists in our role. We publish a lot of books by journalists, and so we're working on the back end to make sure that the stories that they're telling would be in long form. Up to snuff, the same that they would be in short form. I often think of books that we do from journalists as almost like a series of articles. But then the question is how do you amplify that message? And that's where I think that what I do is really unique because then we work with publicists, media personalities, producers to amplify that message. So if you're a journalist out there and you're writing a story, you're probably not promoting every story at that level. But when you do something in long form in book form, we're really working to amplify that message through publicity. So in some ways, I think it's a really unique place to get out some of this messaging simply because we have the benefit of promotion, which I don't think that a lot of journalists do.
It well, maybe part of the reason why they're writing books is to get that promotion. But I think you're right. That there's not a lot of self-aggrandizement happening with the journalists because they really just want to tell the story. And they really want to bring some of these things to awareness. Kevin, what about you?
Yeah, I think I look to kind of my time before working at the Synod as an example of like a good sort of respectful relationship. Before I was working here, I worked at a very small publication called Urban Omnibus. We just were like three of us and a bunch of freelance writers. But we covered kind of the everyday architectures of New York City. And one of my beats was the sort of intersection of real estate and architecture and religion in New York. And I found like having really long-term and sustained relationships with people is really what led to coverage that I was proud of making and I think people were really happy with. I was often publishing interviews with people I had known for years and not really written about. And so I think like creating a real deep and sustained relationship with between journalists and communicators can really lead to that sort of nuanced coverage. And I would say that's a relationship I would lift up as a good one to try to have with journalists.
Do you have a specific story in mind
Yeah, I think like
where this
one thing
really
I was
came
really
through?
proud of was an interview we published with Kate Toth, who runs an organization called Bricks and Mortals, which helps houses of worship with all sorts of real estate problems, anything from developing affordable housing to navigating like landmark law, which is a really difficult thing for under-resourced houses of worships to navigate. And so I've known Kate for about like I known Kate for about 3 or 4 years by the time we actually published a story on her, and I'd actually like taken a class on her work in graduate school for urban planning. And so like having these sorts of sustained relationships, I think led to an interview that with her that was like really deep and really useful. And I think I still look to as a sort of guidebook on the stakes of real estate in New York City for churches.
And if anybody knows anything about New York City real estate, it's just a mess. So, and so a lot of times these churches and these organizations need all the help they can get.
Mhm.
And then Rena, let's round out this question.
Yeah, I had a really good experience with Bob Keenan, who's the communications manager for the Mercy Sisters. I went to cover the synod on synodality that Pope Francis put in place, and it was the first time that women were going to be able to participate. And I one of the things that you notice is how much. I mean, this is terrible to say, but how much reporters gravitate, toward the men, toward the bishops. But the one thing is that, with covering sisters, I called up Bob and I said, Bob, I'm going to this thing. I was wondering if you have anybody who's a little chatty, that I might be able to talk to. And he found me a really, really great sister. We were also just kind of, limited at where we could go. So I told her where it was going to be, and she came over. We started talking. I mean, he found me, just the perfect person for this. And she started telling me how she saw the synod as a dismantling of the hierarchy. And I'd never covered a synod before, but I didn't realize at that time how that impacted the Vatican itself, and especially the men at the Vatican. And I had calls like, how can she be saying this? I had never, thought that it was a controversial statement. Because if you live in the world of sisters, and I'm sure Kathy can tell you this, it's a completely different landscape in the church. And so we put the story out, and what amazed me was how many women reached out to me who were inside and outside the synod to talk to me about their stories, just because of that one story, how they felt that they didn't have a voice, even in an event that was supposed to amplify their voice or include them. So to me, I thank Bob profusely for giving me that contact, but it also helped me plan ahead, and reach out to other communications managers when I was going to an event, because when you're covering something international, you're sort of lost in this sea of people. You don't know who's who, but they can help you find those people, that can give you a really good story, and one that, as Kathy mentioned, one that stands out, because often we're all covering the same story, but and usually people will only read one of those stories. They're not going to read all five about the same event, but you want to give them something different, and that's where I think talking with a communications manager can really help.
Thanks, Rena. I'm kind of gonna build on some things that you all have said, but I want to talk about audience for a little bit. So there's two things, right? As communicators on either side, we have our loyal fan base, right? So we have the people that are going to read our work no matter what we say, right? Um, but then we also want to be going out into new audience and new audience segments and trying to tell more people about what we're doing and about what we're, up to. So how do you strike the balance between trying to reach new audiences while staying true to the audience that you have? How do you get new people while not alienating the people who are already your fans? I don't really have an order for this. Why don't we go with you, Kevin? Because you've been nodding your head.
Well, this is something we're thinking about all the time at the Synod, and I we definitely have our hardcore fans who read every email and every Facebook post, watch every Instagram reel. Like that is a real sort of group we have, but we are always sort of looking outwards. And I think like working with press is one great way to do that. Another way we do that is through like social media. We're blessed to have a bishop who is like Bishop Katrina Foster, who's really, really wonderful at social media and outreach and meeting new people. I was like surprised when I took this job and I looked at her Instagram and found that like many non-religious friends I have were already following her. So I feel very blessed to have her as a sort of compatriot in this outreach. And that also really does help us find press coverage because journalists often find her through this like social media work and also find out about the synod and its work that way. So that's a real strategy we have to reach new audiences, for lack of a better term, but both sort of regular everyday people and journalists that we might work with in the future.
Let's go to Jonathan and then Kathy.
One thing I've always thought about, this is a constant question, no matter, in what form you're producing content. It's like, you have your core audience or your core fans. And then the question is like, how do you both keep that audience and then expand it to find new audiences for your content? How do you keep your hardcore fans while also attracting your future fans? And what I've always said is that it's very hard to go fishing in a pond where you are unknown. But your hardcore fans are already connected to your future fans, and they already have credibility with your future fans. They're their friends, their neighbors, they're in PTAs with them. And so the best messengers to convince your future fans to become your current fans is to leverage your current fans to do that work. So how do you do that? I think that means that you have to make your content highly shareable and you have to make it easy for people to share. So when I was a journalist, for example, I would always read through my columns. Now, I was a columnist, not a reporter, so this is sort of more easier for columnists. And I would always make sure that there were a few like one-liners, that things had been distilled, even if it meant chopping a sentence, so that there were a few one-liners, things that really summarized some of the main points, perhaps in a really emotive way, a way that would be highly shareable. And then I would package that content on social media so that my core fans would amplify the message, leading back my future fans who they were connected to the original content. So I'm always thinking about not just how do I meet the needs of the fan base, but how do I make sure that that fan base is equipped to amplify the message that I want to get out to people who would be likely readers of mine in the future.
That is actually really fascinating advice, right? Lowering the barrier to entry as much as possible so that people can share that information is great. Kathy.
Well, I'm probably going to sound like I'm repeating what Kevin said, but a lot of what I try to do to reach across is to repost content from other organizations that aren't necessarily even Catholic sisters, reach across denominations, and also, tag that group. So that's one way I try to reach out across the Catholic sister bubble to get outside of that. And then when pitching something to, because we have our usual suspects, right? That Global Sisters Report is amazing, and some of the other publications. And when I'm trying to pitch to a more secular newspaper, I will include links to PR we've already received. Just adds a little bit more credibility to, them getting this press release. So those are some of the ways that we do that.
And any last tips from you, Rena?
One of the things, but this is a little bit hard to replicate for most people, but one of the things that we did at Global Sisters Report is we started a website in Spanish because we weren't reaching, even though there's, we have a worldwide audience, we weren't reaching people in the Spanish speaking world. So one of the things that we did is we made a separate site in Spanish, and we also hired translators. So the content isn't, Google translated. It's done by people who know what these nuances are. But it wasn't just enough having the content. It was also, how do I get it out there? And one of the things, again, when it comes to working with communications professionals, that was really helpful, is we contacted the Conference of Men and Women Religious in Latin America, and they have a lot of different commissions, they call them. But whenever we had something that dealt with, sisters in the environment, we would say, "Can you get it out to this commission?" So, we would send them a link. Then, we also started using WhatsApp because they use that a lot. You have to go where you have to look where they're going right now, and then try to find a way to get in there, because there's a lot of spaces that are, these niche spaces that you can go into, but you have to find out what they are. And then, you find people who know where they are, and you put your content in there. And I think that helped us immensely. And it helped us, not just get our content out, but also get new sources, which, are always incredibly helpful when you're trying to cover, like me, when you're trying to cover, so many continents.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Rena. I want to go back to actually something that Kathy said. So Kathy said that when she's pitching things to uh, a journalist that she doesn't normally work with, she puts links to some of the PR they've received to try to establish their credibility, right? I feel like credibility is one, especially within the religion communicator space, that oftentimes has been damaged. I think that there's a lot of faiths out there that perhaps have experienced a certain amount of uh, controversy. And so how do you work on maintaining that credibility? How do you work on making sure that you are still a trusted source of information? So that people don't just discount you. How do you make sure that you maintain that credibility? And since Kathy made the original statement, I'll ask Kathy first.
Okay. Well, and I feel like I'm very blessed to work for Catholic Sisters because even though the Catholic Church definitely has had its share of negativity and issues, the Catholic Sisters are very highly regarded by most people, because these women do phenomenal work out in the world. Um, and so I think the thing for us is that it's more about that we're representatives of the Catholic Church that we work on, because even though we're not in the actual hierarchy with all the men, right? We're still part of it. So I think part of it for us is being true to who we are. They do see themselves as trying to live the gospel. And a lot of that means that you are speaking out against certain things that a lot of people are for, and like Rena brought up before, the whole immigration crisis and environmental issues. So I think what we try to do is be true to who we are, and we are selective in the messaging we put out about those issues.
And then let's move on. Let's do Kevin, Jonathan, and then wrap it up with Rena again.
Yeah, I think like partially a lot of distrust and hurt coming towards religious institutions is like based in very real things that have happened, and like our religious organizations do need to reckon with. And so I think when like we find that press is dealing with these issues, it is important for us as like denominational and religious communicators to be like forthright and honest. And of course, this is like not on communicators alone. Of course, it's also on our whole community to reckon with harm and how to like work towards repair. But being forthright and honest in our working with journalists who may be like writing stories on that, I think is like very important.
I think, these days it's like you could write about kittens and rainbows and you'll find haters. So you're always, it does not matter what you're writing about. You're always having to reckon with your critics, unfortunately. And so, as an editor, when I'm reading content, I'm always sort of thinking, not like the critic, because the critic is never for you. They're never gonna be for you. Kathy, you could write an article for somebody who hates the Catholic Church. It doesn't matter what you say. They hate the Catholic Church, they're gonna come after you. But there is, I think, in between your fan base and the critic, there is the kind of the skeptic, the person who's willing to hear you out. But the way that you kind of draw that person in and establish credibility with them, I think, is one, it's always acknowledging the perspective that you would be most likely to ignore. And there are ways to do that. How do you acknowledge the other side? How do you acknowledge the other voice in the room? How do you answer them proactively? So that's important. And then the other, I think, is I think in particular, journalists are so focused in this day and age on accuracy for credibility. But so much of credibility is wrapped up in vibes. And it's making sure that your tone is open-hearted and authentic, and it is, it's inclusive, that it welcomes the skeptic. And so a lot of times when I'm reading, I'm not just doing an accuracy check, I'm not just doing fact checking, but I'm really asking how this feels and making sure that the way that an article feels is something that would imbue the reader with a sense of credibility as well.
So before Rena gives her comments, can I just follow up on that, Jonathan? With that vibes, right? I really kind of like that. So how do you make sure that you maintain that vibe? What are some things that are going to throw off that vibe right away?
Yep. Well, I'll tell you how I would do it, in practice for me. When I am working with a piece of content, I will think about, if I want this piece of content to be the most effective piece of content possible. So if I wanted to establish credibility, what would be three adjectives, tonal adjectives that I would use to describe the way that piece should feel, right? Would it be academic? Would it be conversational? Would it be persuasive? Would it be curious? And so then I will think about that kind of matrix of how that should feel. And then as I'm working through that or I'm editing that, when I'm thinking about verb choices or, where to cut a quote, I am always bouncing back or referring back to that three sets of adjectives. So what a lot of people don't do is they never ask the question before the question. Like, how should this really feel if it's going to be an effective piece? And creating that objective standard of a criteria before you even get into kind of shaping the piece that you're working on. So I think of that first. I write that down usually somewhere, I post that somewhere, and then that becomes kind of my North Star as I work my way through a piece of content.
That is really sage advice. That's really interesting advice. Thank you, Jonathan. And finally, Rena.
I think, the one thing I've discovered that working at Global Sisters Report is that we have two different audiences, and one of them is the general public, and the other one is sisters. And so they know their world really well, in the way that the general audience is not going to. And one of the things that we have done that is, sometimes really difficult is to bring out some of the darker sides that some might see or experience in religious life. And a couple of weeks ago, I had to write the story about a former sister who had been kicked out of her convent in Spain, and then basically had nowhere to go. They gave her no money because, canon law doesn't say that, the religious community needs to give her any. But here she comes, out of a cloister 20 years later in her 40s, and she has, nowhere to go, no money, no, nothing that, and the world looks completely different. There's internet now. The peseta has changed to the euro. And one of the things that when we put that story out, I also talked to a couple of, younger ones who the journey had been much shorter, 3 years, 7 years, but not 20 years. And, the one thing that it struck a nerve with a lot of sisters because they asked, how can this happen? And what I discovered is that it happens a lot. And it's a really rough landing, but when you're able to open up these worlds or talk about them, especially to an audience that knows it's happening, it's a really, really tough issue to bring out. But it does give you credibility because it's not just the warm and fuzzy stories, and there are a lot of them. And by and large, the world of sisters is that way. There's also some, undertones and darker sides that some of them experience. And I think that we build credibility that way, not just with our general audience, but with the sisters themselves. And they can open up to us about a lot of different things that they won't open up to with most people.
So just a reminder to the audience that if you'd like to, I have plenty of questions. So if you would like me to keep asking questions, I can. But if you would like me to ask some of your questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or to DM me through the chat so that I can make sure that I incorporate what you want to know into this conversation. But I want to build on what you just said, Rena, simply because you said that you talked about the differences between for the sister that was kicked out, right? Like there was new technologies, the peseta had been replaced by the euro, like it was a completely different world. And we do have a lot of different technologies, a lot of different things that we have to factor into our work now. So we have AI, we have data visualization, multimedia storytelling, etc. How are you working? How do you feel like expectations have changed for the work that you produce, and how are you adapting to these new technologies yourselves? And you haven't even been cloistered for 20 years. So Rena, let's go with you first.
I think, it's such a different world than when I came into journalism. I was working in local newspapers, and there was a photographer who came with you, and video was starting, so a videographer came along, and now, as I think the staff has waned, you're that person in one. You're the videographer, you're the photographer. So I think the way that I have looked at it is that when I go out on a story or to cover, something, I'm always looking for what else can I be doing? How can I gather yarn, as we used to call it, for the future? So one of the things, I did last year, I went to cover a meeting in Mexico City of sisters from Latin America, but it was also the Day of the Dead. And then Our Lady of Guadalupe was coming up in December. So that's what, you always know that Our Lady of Guadalupe is going to be something really big. But then I came across a sister who couldn't see, and she was telling me about the sculpture at the shrine at the basilica. And she said, I'm going to go, the sister's going to take me down there. And I said, can I come along, And I thought it would be, neat to see her walking into the basilica, right? And maybe taking a picture. And then she started touching the sculpture, and it was just amazing. And, she can't see, but she's touching it. And, all these people just kind of gathered around her, and I started taking video. And it was kind of a neat moment, but I know that I'm not going to put it there that day or the next day, because this feast is coming up. The incredible thing to me is that it was like our most viewed video of the year. But the thing is that I ended up writing a story based on the video, not because, so the visual aspect of it kind of starts changing in the other parts of your of your life as a reporter, that I need a story to go with this video. And you start looking around for different things, that might bring some light, or to your story, to your website, to your organization. A few weeks ago, I was up in New York for the Archbishop Hicks installation, and by chance I ran into him, in the middle of the street, right near St. Patrick's, and I took this video of people just around him, these friends of his from Chicago who just happened to find him there. And it was kind of neat because he's not in his garb, he's just like he's in this puffy coat, with his, puffy gloves, just like, a guy in the street. And you have to think about all of those things. What am I trying to, what am I trying to show people? Not just the official version, but how things spontaneously happen, and we see them. We always saw them as reporters, but now we can show them, in a video or in a photo, how these things spontaneously happen as well. And I think they've been great tools.
Interesting. Kathy, do you want to take a next shot at it?
Yeah. So I guess I would say my role is jack of all trades, master of none. We are a small community. When they hired me, my strong background is in graphic design and then writing. And so when they hired me, I replaced those people, and then we grew the social media. And then it was like, oh, we need to do more videos. So, it's kind of just been mission creep from day one, right? But I love it all. I love the challenge. With challenge comes opportunity, is what I always try to tell myself. So, yeah, I would say just trying to keep ahead of what the next thing is, we need to be aware of. And then also discerning, does it work for us? Because, we're on Facebook and Instagram, and we've determined it doesn't really suit our purposes to be on much more than that. I know other larger communities are. So I think that's also part of it, is trying to have the wherewithal to figure out what's working for your organization and what's not. And lately we've been I have a freelance videographer I work with. So we've been doing a lot of videos about the sisters in ministry, which I think are fascinating. They're 7 to 8 minute videos, and we've been putting those out there. So I'm always trying to think of a new way to tell our story, like the rest of you, to capture people's attention.
How about Jonathan and then Kevin?
Ryan, I was listening to Kathy and Rena. Can you
So we're just
restate the question just one more time
so
so I
we're
can?
just talking about emerging technologies. How are you trying to stay abreast of emerging technologies, incorporate them into your work? How can we use some of these new things to our advantage?
Yeah. Well, we have to talk about artificial intelligence. It is the red hot center of the conversation. Well, there are some unique challenges using AI in book publishing because of copyright laws. So we have to use a ChatGPT enterprise server, so something that doesn't feed information back. And I think if I were in journalism still, I would be using an enterprise server, so I wouldn't be taking any content and sending it back to some technocratic overlord for lots of reasons. But I think one of the things I will say is I have found that particularly in the early advent of AI, most people think about AI as a teacher. It can tell you what you should do or what you should say, or it's going to teach you something that is going to be advantageous in your role. And I think that we have to think about our interactions with AI as sort of content generators, content creators, however you want to talk about this kind of the big umbrella under which we all sit, as both teacher and student. So you have to, instead of just thinking about AI as something extractive, like I can go and ask it to research something for me. I'm always trying to train it as well. So when I create a finished product based on, some information that it gave me, I say, now I want to show you what I've created as a result of our conversation. I'd like you to extract four key learnings about how I think or how I edit and commit that to your permanent memory. So I'm always making sure that it is getting better and better at understanding how I think, the kinds of questions that are animating my work, what I am taking from it, and what I'm leaving behind. And most people, I don't think, close the loop on that. They go, they ask a question, they move on. And I think that this is going to become a permanent companion in our work. There's just no doubt about that. And you have to help it get better so that it can help you get better.
That is a really, really insightful thing to think of the AI as both a teacher and a student. I really appreciate that perspective. Kevin.
Yeah, I want to echo a lot of what Kathy was saying about like the values of like video and new media. We're working on a project right now that we're calling Faces of Faith, where we will be profiling people throughout our community in sort of like well-produced 6 to 7 minute videos that will both live online and also as a sort of curriculum for adult learning programs. But another thing that I think is really unique and new about our technological moment is that we're in this time when like everyday people are also producing media at a scale we've never seen before. Everyone is a photographer, everyone is a blog writer in a way. And this is not to like diminish the work of professional photographers and writers, but every week people I work with and people from churches throughout our synod end up just sending me photos from their weekly services and their weekly work. And I find it so wonderful to be able to spend time with the pictures that they took and be kind of able to see the world through their eyes and taking the time to like look at what they think is important in their church and community is something I really value each week. It like tells me so much about who they are and who we are together. And it's like such a delight to to share those in our newsletter each week and on Instagram. They're not the best photos in the world, but that's not really the point. It's like such a generous opportunity to get to know one another through like the act of making together. And that's, I think, something that's really special about all the new technology that we have.
So I did get a question, and I want to kind of double back to what you said, Kevin, about these, faith, people of faith and trying to do these interviews with people, right? Because a lot of times uh, we're tasked by our leadership, right? You can only work with these outlets. Or we're tasked by the outlets, I want to work with this person. Or we're tasked by our leadership saying, this is the spokesperson for this project, when sometimes we might feel it a little bit differently, that somebody else might be better, or we would like to highlight this voice or whatever, right? So if there's one thing that you could talk about, like what what kind of constraints do you have that you wish people understood better? In terms of being able to get your work done. So if people are asking you, can you do this for me? Can you do this for me? And you're saying no all the time, like what are these constraints that you work under and how can we get over those constraints? So Kevin, let's have you go first. And then we'll go to Jonathan and then Rena and then Kathy.
I'm not sure I have a great answer for this, but I will say like as a religion communicator, we're often doing a lot at all at once. And so understanding that we're all kind of stretched thin and like sometime and also sometimes our work is quite slow. I found this a lot when I was doing like management around like real estate development for churches, is that like the sort of time that churches and religious institutions can take is very outside of things like grant cycles or news cycles sometimes. So understanding, like being understanding of a sort of like different pace of work and a different like pace of being in the world is something I think like would be like helpful. But I don't know if that really answers your question too
No,
well.
that is true though. I mean, it's things that we don't think about that we get frustrated with, but it's good to know those things. And then we have about 1 minute each for Jonathan, Kathy, and Rena.
Well, I was going to say time. Time is one as well, and having to do a lot. So Kevin took some of the words out of my mouth, but one of them for me is results. How many of us have said, "Well, we're going to write this story and it's gonna go viral," and then it falls flat, or then you write something else that you think is going to go nowhere, and it becomes like your top story of the month. And so, what I've done is do my best to extract learnings when something is successful, but also not becoming too attached to expectations about which articles will or won't go crazy, because otherwise you just end up living on this emotional roller coaster. And one day you feel like a success, and the next day you feel like a failure. And I think one of the most important things you can do is get off that roller coaster so that you can be present and do your job.
Thank you. Kathy?
Yeah, I was going to say the like button is evil on on Facebook because I'm the same way, Jonathan. I'm like, oh, this is going to be great. We're going to get tons of hits on this. And then, like you say, it's like wah wah. No, no one cares. And also, it's managing the expectations of my leadership because, they care so much about, certain things and they'll want me to push that out and they'll be like, oh, everyone will want to read about this. And sometimes it's me kind of gently saying, why don't we look at doing, something a little different because this may not be what our audience wants to read about. So that's also part of it is just managing expectations on the part of your leadership and also about how much you can do. I find that a lot and how long it takes you to do things. It's always me against the clock, it seems like.
And then let's wrap it up with Rena.
Well, I've learned a lot from all of you right now with your answers because I mean I'm still managed by my emotions sometimes, by oh this will be the greatest story ever, and then no one looks at it, and then you are disappointed. But the one thing is that there are stories that are important, whether they get traction or not. And I think that's what I have to ultimately rely on is that again, maybe nobody wants to read about the dark side of sisters, or that this happened, but it's still an important thing. So you have to also get away from the likes and from this approval. And I really appreciate what Jonathan said. I do need to be present in the moment of something, but still there are stories that may not get a lot of likes, but they're still important.
Well, thank you. Thank you to everybody. This was a fantastic conversation. Thank you to Kevin and Jonathan and Rena and Kathy. I appreciate all of your comments. Thank you very much to Emily from the Religion News Association. It really was a collaborative effort between the RCC and the RNA, and so I appreciate everybody being willing to tune in. Just as a quick reminder, the RCC and the RNA are both having our conventions, our national conventions, coming up in April. The RCC from April 16th to 18th, and the RNA from April 23rd to 25th. If you are so inclined, we would love to have you join us for both of those. More information can be found both at religioncommunicators.org and at rna.org. So have a wonderful day, and thank you all for tuning in.